Welcome to another episode of Erik Waite Whiskey Studies, and I have been really enjoying Texas month. I almost feel like I could do an entire Texas year, but I would need to go back to Texas and visit some more distilleries and get some more whiskeys, which I'm actually planning to do later this year, and I'm already planning on doing Texas Whiskey Month for 2020. I was going to go back to Texas actually next week, but changes my schedules and so forth. So I'm hoping to maybe back there in August or September and visit more distilleries because there's a lot of whiskeys down there that you can't get outside of Texas. I'm looking forward to getting back there. So I went to 5 distilleries in Texas, started off at Garrison, dropped by the Crowded Barrel. Then I went to Balcones. I went to Treaty Oak. And then my final stop for the coup de grace, for the coup de grace, was Ironroot Republic Distillery. It had an absolutely fantastic time. If you haven't seen it already, I recorded a video. It's about 20 minutes long or so. And in that video, we actually talk about the mash bills with the Likarish brothers. But today in this premiere, I have got Robert Likarish on, and we're going to talk a little bit more about their whiskey. So, Robert, why don't you say hello, everyone in the chat?
How's it going, everybody?
So it's actually 8 a.m. here. So I'm starting my bourbon drinking a little late in the day. You try to get started about 6 a.m. to get the day started off right.
Yeah, loosen up the body a little bit.
So, and what I've got, which I already reviewed. This is the Ironroot Harbinger. This is the BBC edition. Again, I'll put a link to the video for this at the end of this video. It's about a 60.5% alcohol by volume, 121 proof. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, as well as this other bottle that I picked up there. This is the MMC. But before we get into that, I want to know a little bit more about Robert's background, his family's background, and his brother's background, and how they got into the whiskey business.
Well, we started out well over a decade ago, it feels like at this point. We wandered up actually to a small distillery in Spokane, Washington, while we were on a family reunion. It was a small distillery called Dry Fly. They had just opened up. We walked out. It was in a shopping center of all places. And my family, we'd been to wineries, been to breweries, but we'd never been to a distillery before. So we wandered in, and immediately we saw the stills. And there's something about copper that is just like moves my soul a little bit. I think it has to do. My family originally is from Butte, Montana, which is home of the Copper King. So there's copper in our blood, is what my mother likes to say a little bit.
So you're actually not a ginger. You're actually a copper.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, we have to correct people. So, especially as I get older, I get more coppery, I think.
There you go.
It's being around the stills, so we're just natural. But we that day, my brother and I, we agreed with my dad that when we retired, that we would start a distillery. However, obviously, I'm not retired. I actually went to law school, graduated from law school, but decided that law wasn't where I wanted to spend my life. I think a lot of people thank me for that every day now. But there's not one more lawyer in the world, I guess. But and Jonathan, he actually got a ton of engineering degrees: biomedical engineering, mechanical, industrial. Again, he's master's degrees and everything. He was actually designing drill bits and saws for neurosurgery before I dropped the bomb at like Christmas dinner, telling my family that I wasn't going to be a lawyer, that I was going to go ahead and start distilling. And he basically looked and said, "I'm not going to sit in a cubicle all day long. I'm going to go jump and do it." And I think his wife about had a heart attack.
Well, I've got degrees in criminal justice, biblical studies, theology, and enology, winemaking, and a lot of certifications in the wine industry. So long before I got into whiskey, I was doing completely different things. Daniel Whitting said if I was, born like 400 or 500 years ago, I would have been one of those guys who were a scribe in a library, doing research and doing the fancy artful writing on the script. And he was absolutely right. That's sort of the kind of a nerdy guy that I am. But as I was studying, actually my route, I was en route to become a master of wine, and was studying for the Wines per Educational Trust diploma. to get me into the Master Wine program. And one of the units was on spirits. I had a Macallan 12-year-old, and next thing I knew, I was going in a completely different direction. And now, I became a certified whiskey ambassador, and now I'm in about 38 days, I think, I'll be back in Scotland, and I'll be going to the Edinburgh Whiskey Academy to study there. And over the next couple of weeks, over the next 34 days following this, I'll be posting videos on Scotch whiskey history. After that will be my visit to Scotland, and then there'll be another 17-part series on Scotch whiskey business. And all of that, my preparing those videos, is actually to prepare me to pass the exam to get the diploma in Scotch whiskey from the Edinburgh Whiskey Academy. So anyhow, so it's interesting to see different routes, different paths people took, and somehow they end up going into whiskey. They find that as a passion, and then just really go full bore into it.
And for me, like, so your entry into spirits was originally wine, and then jumping ship in that program. For us, our first, or for at least for me personally, my first love was actually brandies, Armagnac, Cognac. I just dove head deep into them. And again, a lot of people ask me, well, Armagnac, how did a 21, 22-year-old get into Armagnac of all things? And it's just, my parents were drinking wine, and wasn't really, I enjoyed wine, but it wasn't really something I was really felt like getting nerdy about. And one of the wine brokers, he beckoned me to the side, and he pulled out this bottle of Armagnac and started pouring Armagnac. So when I was in college, the first distillery I actually ever visited was Highland Park, which is it's a heck of a journey to get up to Highland Park. I tell you what.
I'll be going. That's my last stop on my trip to Scotland this year.
Well, I mean, with your background in theology, Orkney's a pretty good place for you to end up too. So.
Along with the Vikings.
Yeah.
So one of the funny things is important studying Scotch whiskey history is Cognac and Armagnac. And the wine industry and so forth. It's actually their failure which led to the success of Scotch whiskey in the 1800s because of the phylloxera plague, which basically wiped out the vineyards. You didn't have vineyards, you don't have grapes. You don't have grapes, you don't have wine. Don't have wine. You don't have Cognac and Armagnac, which then boosted the presence of Scotch back in the 1800s. But so the production style of Cognac and Armagnac, and understanding the alembic still and so forth. And I know you went over there and studied. How much has that played into stylistically into how you do your whiskeys?
It is basically at the heart of everything that we do here. Again, we through our studies before we even started the distillery, ended up meeting up with Nancy Fraley and Hubert Germain Raban, who master cognac distiller that moved out to California in the 80s because he wanted to start distilling a New World grapes rather than just the rigid grape varietals that they have too in cognac. And I tell you what, it really opened our eyes. Again, American distilling has a very different, very different approach than what the French do. And it was the French, especially for us, that when we knew we were going to be going back to Texas to start the distillery, a lot of the concepts that they're using, especially when it gets to the warehousing, is all on minimizing impact of tannin and really balancing out tannins, which that we knew that was going to be one of the huge issues going into aging product in Texas, is how do you balance out that extreme extraction out of the casks?
Right.
That really has been a part of what we do and how we handle our spirits in the warehouse. Is a lot of those cognac. It's a process that they call specifically élevage,
right,
which means to raise, and I think they use the same term in wine, but it is absolutely at the heart of everything we do.
So élevage in wine, slightly. So one of the things in going from the wine background into the whiskey is some things convert over, some things don't convert over, and some same terms but slightly different. So élevage in wine is, if you weren't going to necessarily do heavy filtering, you're moving your wine from barrel to barrel to barrel, leaving behind sediment, and then eventually into the bottle. So élevage, that raising, is sort of changing from barrel to barrel and then eventually get into the bottle. So it's sort of the process of removing sediment without necessarily using filtering. But you talk about the tannins. So yeah, the heavy extraction, why you want vanilla and cinnamon and other flavors, there's always a danger of particularly in something very intense and fast, to getting wood tannins that might give it a mouth feel. I know uh, Jared Hempstead talks a lot about the importance of mouth feel for his whiskeys. Is if you did too intense, too extreme, you might get some bitter tannins coming off the wood.
Right, and you can really see it, especially with even with a little bit younger Texas whiskeys. Again, when you're in that 6 to 9 month period, when you're getting really starting to pull the new tannin out, though it's getting so deep and pulling so much of that kind of raw tannin out that it does. I mean, it's when we first were tasting through the whiskeys as they were aging, it was almost a little bit of a scary moment for us because you get some really really strong bitter tannins, and it's learning how to handle those and mitigate those, and how to like encourage the barrels to balance those out a little bit better. As I know in cognac, when they're using the élevage process, a lot of it is lowering the proof slowly over time. It's moving it from newer casks into slightly more used casks, again, to balance out and do that lower tannin impact. For us, obviously with bourbon, I can't move it into more used casks for bourbon. But that is actually the process we use for like our corn whiskeys and our single malts and some of those whiskeys, and also for our brandies that we're doing. It is a progressive move through more used and used casks as they get older.
So you actually went over to Cognac and Armagnac. For those who don't know, so Cognac is sort of northeast of the Bordeaux region. Armagnac is southeast of the Bordeaux region. I'm going to get too geeky here. So the primary grapes would be like Uni Blanc, known as Trebbiano in Italy, Follet Blanc, Colombard, Baco. Baco is mostly used because it's phylloxera resistant. So different grapes than you say than typically they would use here in the United States for making brandy. So did you actually get some hands-on experience in the production process while you're over there, or is it mostly observation?
So initially, a lot of it was observation because again, you need to learn firsthand. But especially on the last trip I was out there, I was getting to go in, showing up at the distillery at 5 a.m., loading the still, running the still, making the cuts, and it's talking with the old French guys. What's really interesting about the Cognac and Armagnac regions as far as how production does, it's like almost flipped from what it's done in the U.S. Like typically in the U.S., most brands are going to be buying from like bigger distilleries and then selling the spirit from the bigger distilleries. In cognac, most of the houses, they're buying from small producers and they're using that into the blend. So the small producers are actually distilling for all the big houses there, which is what was a really cool, very different concept than what I was used to. So you have tons of all over kind of I think there's 5,000 distilleries in cognac and 138 or so brands.
Right.
And so a lot of these small producers, the big distilleries hire out these small farmers to distill. And so you can go over there and distill with them. And it's really, really fascinating because they're talking, it's their grandfather and you'll get like 3 generations standing there with you, and they're all talking about what they've seen over the years and what years were good, what years were bad. And it's just a really, really immersive experience.
One of the amazing things, so I haven't been to Bordeaux, of course, been over to Scotland, getting ready to go back to Scotland. California is one of the youngest states in the United States, and architecturally, if a building is 100 years old, it's like, ooh, that's old, because even a lot of the old buildings burned down or fell down because of fires or earthquakes. So I don't want to get off on talking about cognac and Armagnac too much. I think one of the reasons, I know at least in in Burgundy, reasons why you're having a lot of small producers contributing to one producer is because the Napoleonic Code, in which inheritance of properties got divided up differently than they had before. And so you have a lot of very, very, very small estates who a lot of times don't produce enough by themselves to make their own product. Therefore, collectively, through a negotiant, their various vineyards, or in this case, distilleries, produce there's very small amounts that then collectively can go into producing enough quantity to produce an actual brandy.
Exactly. Like Martell actually has the biggest distillery in all of cognac, but which again you wouldn't think so. I mean, they are one of the major producers, but they still buy a ton of product from the smaller producers as well.
So what would you say in layman's terms, what would be the difference between taking a cognac or armagnac? By the way, I'm not a big cognac and armagnac drinker, but I tend to even though people talk about cognac, I actually like armagnac better. It seems to me I'm a little bit more robust, a little bit more flavor than a lot of cognacs. What do you think?
I agree. I end up drinking a lot more Armagnac. It tends to be a little bit higher proof, just based on kind of the production methodology and the kind of expectations of it. It tends to have a lot less dosage with most of the brands, which again I really appreciate. Now, again, with anything you can really find some really unique cognacs, especially when you go there. There was one cellar that we visited that they had, vintages that went back to the 1800s, and went back, was talking with them. They actually allowed us to do what they call the decades tasting, where we tasted stuff from 1900, 1912, 1926, 1934, 1942, which again, when you start getting into some of those years, you're like, oh yeah, well, the French didn't actually harvest this crop.
Okay, right.
It's great, but some of those are like 60% alcohol, which is not typically something that you see from a cognac.
Just so that I'm not the only wine geek bringing in fancy schmancy terms, you used a word a couple sentences ago, dosage, which sounds like a feminine hygiene product. Do you want to tell the viewers what a dosage is?
So dosage, you typically see it in brandies or rum where they're using sugars or syrups, or boisé, which is like a barrel-aged oak tea, essentially. And generally they're like 20% alcohol. And a lot of the houses, they created them, their grandfathers or great-grandfathers created them. So they're actually been, some of this dosage that they're adding to it has been aging in cask for 40, 60 years, 100 years, which is really interesting. But it's really adding a little bit of either something for coloring or syrup for like sweetener, or especially for like a lot of the lower end younger cognacs and stuff, they're going to add a lot more sweetener to them. Or boisé, getting a little bit oak, a little bit more oak structure to the spirit.
So in champagne, this is how, you have your various levels of sweetness in champagne, whether it's going to be, brut or whatever. It's all determined by the dosage, what you add in at the end. All right, we're going to get back to whiskey. So, man, they're talking about brandies and they're talking about wine and grapes. Let's get back to whiskey. So stylistically in approach to then producing whiskey, how would you say that influences your approach versus how more typical others might be producing whiskey?
So on the distilling side, it's going to have a lot to do with like the temperatures that we're running or cooling for our condensers, because again, that can really influence how much kind of esterification that's actually going to be occurring inside the still. And also will encourage, again, how heavy the spirit is going to be coming out, kind of that back end, how much mouthfeel you're going to get from the spirit. So there's a lot of ways you can run the still, temperature wise and speed wise, that can really influence how the spirit comes out. On the barrel aging side is where you see a ton of stuff for us on that. That's going to be one, we're going to be going through, and after a whiskey hits about a year old, we will start tasting every barrel in the warehouse about every 4 to 6 months or so. And that's really, and we'll start taking notes on every specific barrel and kind of which direction they're going. Are they becoming more spicy? Are they becoming sweet? They're developing a really great fruit profile. What's the mouthfeel like? And we're really judging the spirit and really watching its maturation on an individual basis. So sometimes we'll find barrels, they aren't doing exactly what we want them to do. And so again, you can go in and either we can pull that whiskey out of that barrel and move it to a different barrel. In the case of bourbon, we're not going to do that because that's, again, plays with the bourbon laws a little bit. But with bourbon, if we see it's taking on too much tannic too quickly or tannin too quickly, we can actually lower proof in cask to actually encourage it to pull out a little bit more of the wood sugars rather than pulling out tannin. And so we really do manage the barrels on an individual basis. Also, we will do the practice of what's called slow reduction. So about a year out, we actually will put together what we call coupe de mares, mother blends. So we kind of have an idea of what the blend's going to be for certain releases, and we'll actually start the reduction process over a year out. Especially for anything that's going to be under 100 proof, it will be slowly reduced, or like Promethean, that's the 103 proof. That one will get very slowly reduced from that 118, 120 proof down to its bottling strength. So before that whiskey comes out of the barrel, it's going to be very within a couple percentages of its bottling strength, because our goal is to add the least amount of water possible at the very end, because that will not. Whiskey holds together a lot better if you do a slow reduction versus adding water. Really
you get a lot better integration rather than boom at the end. You slowly integrate it in the process over time.
Correct, and you're also going to influence what it's pulling out of the wood too. So again, the lower proof, you're going to pull out very different things than you do with the higher proof, because there's different things in the barrel that are water soluble versus alcohol soluble. So you can really kind of coax a blend into where you want it to be.
Now, one of the interesting variables, of course, got to get back to wine. We talk about provenance, talk about terroir, climate, and so forth, and Bordeaux and Burgundy, Cognac, their climate is very, and they have a lot of weather variations. Good years, bad years. So 2009, 2010, woohoo, 11, 12, okay, 13, 14, meh, 15, woohoo. California, we're a little bit more moderate. We don't get such wild fluctuations. So one of the interesting things for me in going to Texas and learning more about Texas, and how big Texas is, we talked a little bit about this with Spencer Whalen in the video where we talked about the Texas Whiskey Association and all the variations of climates and so forth in Texas. So in all that, in terms of the spirit interacting with the wood, how much play have you got in dealing with temperatures and where the barrels are at, or is it just kind of, it is what it is and we got to make our adjustments in another way?
So for us, again, we're the farthest north of the whiskey distilleries right now. So we have a little bit more temperate, relatively compared to the rest of Texas. We're not quite as hot as if you go down to Garrison and some of those areas. Our actual warehouse is insulated though, so we don't see quite the huge temperature swings. So really the reason why we still get the intensity of flavor and stuff out of the wood is more to do with the length of the summer rather than to the intensity of the summer. Because our warehouse, we've never seen triple digits in our barrel warehouse, which is, wow. If you go to Balcones or Garrison, they see it pretty drastically, pretty easy. Wow.
Because we get, I'm here in the Bay Area, we'll get usually around the 4th of July, you'll get a few 100+ degrees, but the rest of the time it tends to be in the low 90s. The last couple of years with all the fires, it was insane. We had over 100 degrees for like a couple of weeks, which is unusual. But anyway, so one other thing I'm interested in is how a whiskey then reflects its sense of place. So one of the things I was picking up from Garrison Brothers, I was picking up notes, and I wasn't sure if it was from the barrels or actually from the surroundings. I was actually picking up sort of a wild brush, tree, herbal characteristic, which I sort of associated when I drove into the area, rolled down my window and smell what's around me. That sort of climatic impact of it. So what would you say for your whiskeys and where you're at, what is making it more Texan than, say, Kentuckian in terms of the sense of place?
One obviously is going to be grain usage, where 95% of the grain we're using is coming from our local area, which the corns and the wheats that are actually grown in this area, again, and we've got a couple different areas that we pull from too, which is kind of fun, that have different soil types, and you can actually see the reaction and the chemical makeup of those particular grains based on kind of where they're coming from in the area, and it will impact flavor a little bit. Obviously, the weather, the climate, we're going to be a little bit more humid than you're going to see in Garrison as well. Compared to Kentucky, we have more humidity, longer summer, but we get kind of the tail end, the bottom part of all of those storms that roll through Oklahoma. And those drastic barometric pressure shifts, that makes a huge impact on the spirit that's in our warehouses. Because one, there's nothing you can do to change it. That's just going to happen.
Right.
And
Even if
that
you change the temperature, it's nothing to do about the barometric pressure.
exactly. Temperatures, again, you could insulate more. You could, if you wanted to, I guess you could cool down your warehouses. We don't. Because again, it's a little bit of that French notion that something should have provenance, that it tastes like
Right.
it from somewhere. And so for us, you still get the barrel influence from those big shifts in pressure, but you're not going to get quite the high heat influence. So our proof and cast doesn't spike nearly as high as what you see down in Garrison, but also it is going to go up faster than what you see in Kentucky. So we're kind of almost a midpoint in between
Okay.
the styles, which is something when we looked at where that was something that we did take into account of what we're doing and what we're looking at is where are we and what should we see, what should whiskey from us taste like, and that's a lot of people, and I have no idea if it's more just like an influence from us or from somewhat from the grain and kind of yeast selection a little bit. But we do tend to get a lot of people to say that they get a lot of grape or fruit type notes in our whiskeys.
Exactly. And that was kind of blowing my mind. I mean, I was a little confused by it, and I mentioned that in the review that I posted, earlier this morning, is the one comment I had is, if I didn't know better, I would say it spent a little bit of time in a port cask.
It's something that just seems to have naturally grown. I think it's a combination of some of the choices that we've made. One, Bloody Butcher alone is going to have a lot more fruit. It has a lot of fruit built into that particular, almost fruit and a little bit of nuttiness naturally. How we treat that corn, again, how we roast it here on site, will impact a little bit of how that nuttiness comes through. Yeast selection is also something that I don't think gets talked about quite enough in the bourbon world. And for us, we actually use a combination of a couple different yeasts, and one of them is actually an older Macallan yeast. They call it M1 from Fermentus. It's an older school Scotch yeast. And so you see some different flavor profiles develop from that. But I think, and that one of the biggest things for me that impacted me in France is talking about when you were talking to the French distillers. There's climate has a lot to do with what they do. Obviously the grapes, where they're coming from. But the third big major prong of what they consider, what they call terroir, was the people. And I think the people have a huge impact on let's make it, which for me, every time when a craft distillery comes to us and wants advice on different things, my biggest thing is what you need to develop is your house style. I want to be able to, no matter what's in your lineup, I want to be able to taste something and go, this is from this distillery. And I think with Balcones, I can pick it out in about 2 seconds.
I was thinking that same thing, and I talked a little bit about this with Jared Hempstead, and we started talking a little bit towards the end of our discussion, talking a little about music, and in fact, I talked about this with the Josh Galladay as well when I had him on. And he's a guitarist. I had this album by Otmar Liebert, and I didn't know that Carlos Santana was on one of the songs. And I'm listening to him, all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute, that sounds like Carlos Santana. He can't get away from sounding like Carlos Santana. So then even if you don't know he's on the song, on the album, you're going to hear him. And I think even though a player or winemaker or whiskey maker, they might necessarily recognize their own impact, their own terroir, their own contribution. And yet I think Jared definitely does have a particular style. And you kind of say, even if you're doing blind, this seems to have a particular Jared Hempstead influence on these whiskeys.
I agree, and it's what was so fun is that, again, one of the things is the relationships we have as a Texas distillery is a very close for the grain to glass distilleries. There is a very close relationship, and early on, Jared and Zach came up from Balcones, and they did a run with us. We distilled here, and even that whiskey, as it came off the still, and as we still have in the barrel warehouse, tasting that whiskey, it has a little bit of that I don't know, kick of Jared, or just every time we go back to it, it's one of those that I can really pick out as something that has something a little bit reflective of what they do, and that's to me is one of the most fun things as a distiller is being able to see stuff like that.
So we talked a little about the corn. So this is the BBC, the Bloody Butcher corn. One of the things I didn't get into in my review of this whiskey was the actual mash bill. So, what do you happen to know? Remember what the mash bill is on this one?
Yeah, for that barrel, it was 95% yellow corn and 5% bloody butcher corn.
Oh, okay, all right. And this one's the MMC, and I don't remember if you mentioned this one or not. I'll be getting into this one during the next Texas Whiskey Month. What's MMC stand for?
That's the magic mana corn. So obviously, we're very creative with
All
our
right, and this one.
abbreviation.
Okay, so this
Uh,
is like a little sweeter, right?
it's gonna be a little bit sweeter of a corn.
Some
Magic.
honey nut. I remember some honey notes.
It's a little bit honeyed. Off the still when that particular corn comes off the still, it's almost like sugar cookies.
Right.
It's we kind of fell in love with that corn. So that's corn that's slowly being integrated into. We had 4 core mash bills. I would say that's probably becoming the 5th of the core mash bills that we make now for on the corn/bourbon side of the distillery.
So now I'm talking about. I mean, we're finishing up Texas month. I got other studies, other regions I got to study.
Oh,
I'm already looking forward to next to 2020, next Texas Whiskey Month. Might do it in January, might do it in February, get a little earlier in the year. But as soon as you mentioned the name of it, I'm like, oh yeah, and I remember that one. I remember being a little sweeter, a little bit more honeyed, and really different from this one. I mean, they're both harbingers, and yet really, really different. And this one's interesting this morning because it's a little bit more savory. I can't remember if I mentioned this while recording or before we started recording. Right now, I'm actually getting almost like a barbecue spice rub. The spice character is really showing itself very differently than it was when I just recorded and had it last night. Really, really great whiskey.
oh yeah, and that's Bloody Butcher. Again, when we first started, the first kind of month that we were distilling, we did probably about 5 or 6 different tests, and Bloody Butcher was one of 2 whiskeys that really just stood out to us. And again, it's only 5% of the mash bill, but the way that we've been able to integrate it into how we mash it, how we cook it, it's just that 5% makes a huge difference in the entire whiskey. So, like when you look at the difference between the Bloody Butcher and the Magic Mana, it's 5% Bloody Butcher. The other one is 5% Magic Mana. Other than that, they're the exact same base grain, exact same cast type, and the same part of the warehouse. But even when we were walking around tasting them, they're drastically different whiskeys.
And the funny thing is, so most people would think, well, 5%, what difference does that make? Well, in wine, particularly, let's take Bordeaux. You have basically 5 different grapes: Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cab Franc, Malbec, and Petit Verdot. And Petit Verdot, sometimes they have 1%, 2%. And you're like, well, that's insignificant. Who would notice a difference? Well, that little 1 or 2% of Petit Verdot fills in a flavor profile in the mid palate. It adds a little bit of color. It adds a little bit of floral notes. And you wouldn't think such a small amount would make a difference, but it really, really can. That tells you just how impactful just a little bit of the Bloody Butcher corn can really have on a whiskey.
Oh yeah, and even when we go to blending like the regular 115 proof Harbinger release, it's the way that again the way that been taught to blend from Nancy Fraley was, again, you kind of have your base, you have your kind of that we build like kind of the sweetness and kind of oak structure on, then you kind of have your fruit profile that's going to be a little bit more nuanced barrels. And the very top, sometimes even a 30-barrel blend, you want to just add a little bit of spice or a little bit of this, a little bit of smoke or something like that to the blend, and that may be, you might pull only like 10 gallons out of a barrel to add to the blend, and it will shift that blend just the way you want it. A single barrel can really shift a blend. If it's under 1,000 barrel blend, you'd be amazed with how much impact even single barrels have.
So we talked a little bit about the terroir of the winemaker or the whiskey maker, and you mentioned a little bit how Jared had come in and just his little bit of influence, particular unique character to those whiskeys. So again, use an analogy from music. If you listen to the Beatles, Lennon and McCartney, and then you listen to them separately, you can hear Lennon and Lennon, you can hear McCartney and McCartney. But when I listen to Paul McCartney, to say the early years, particularly with Wings, I can go, he's missing the John Lennon element, and John Lennon was on his own, definitely missing the Paul McCartney element to it. So Paul McCartney, definitely, I would say, major influencer, really a big impact on the Beatles. And yet, if you remove John Lennon, it's not quite the same. It comes a little bit too sweet, I might say, the music. John brought a little bit more of the rustic, earthy sort of um, vanguard kind of character to the music. So you're not the sole producer here, and neither is your brother Jonathan, who's not with us in this video, but he was in the other one. So do you guys, what kind of discussions do you guys have in terms of, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Hey, have you ever thought about doing this? Well, I don't know about doing that. Let's do this instead. Or how does that typically go?
It's constant. And that's, I would say, every single person at the distillery, which again, that's four of us that are on the production side, and we have one bartender that helps us out too. But every single person on the blending side is involved in the production side. And anytime there's a question that comes up or idea or something, we're always bouncing it off each other. Marcia, again, has come up with some ideas or found a new corn that she thought would be really interesting. And it's amazing how much of a collaborative effort making whiskey for us really has to be. The whiskey would not be, as you said, would not be the same if it was a single person dictating. I think the biggest example I have of that is actually the Icarus release, the port and peat cask corn whiskey that we released a few weeks ago. That was, and especially in the blending room, it was one of those things that I wanted more peat to it, and Jonathan was like, "Well, we need to hold off on the." And it was, again, finding that really great middle ground that really defined the balance. Because I think sometimes each of us can be unbalanced or have preferences in an unbalanced way, and it's always a goal of working with each other, because we know that if we all agree on something, then it's going to be something that's really special.
Again, back to music. I think of the Beatles, and I think the contributions of Ringo and George. George, "Here Comes the Sun," something. Ringo, Octopus's Garden, Yellow Submarine. They had a character, and oftentimes George and Ringo would work together in a similar way that Paul and John would work together. But then there is some Paul and Lennon influence even on their songs, and vice versa. Ringo had a very unique drumming style. So even though in some sense George and Ringo were maybe a lesser player in the overall sound, still they had that impact. And when they're not there, it's noticed that it's missed. So I've been on tasting panels for wine. We're doing, say, Pinot Noir, and you've got maybe 10 barrels of Pinot Noir, and each barrel is a little bit different. And so we're trying to figure out, the percentages of what we want from different barrels to go into an overall wine. And usually there's the winemaker, then there's me, who's the somm, and then there's the owners who have all the money, and they want to call the shots. And so the winemakers are at one end of the table, me, the somm, I'm at the other end of the table, and the owners, people with the money, are in the middle. And so the winemaker will give his comments, the owners will make their comments, and then I'm sort of the ringer, and I go, I have to go with the winemaker on this one. I think we're more like we should do this and this and this. And the owners are like, well, okay. They're bringing sort of the ringer to, because just because they're the owner doesn't necessarily mean they're always right about everything. But you have to make them happy as well. But it always ends up being a collaborative effort to come as to what is the best blending of barrels to produce the right wine. So how does that typically work in having you have a tasting panel? And how does it, do you cast votes or just going back and forth? How does that work out?
So for us, again, we'll work through as a panel and work out probably about 5 different blends from the barrel selections that we have. And again, that'll take place over about a week or two, coming up with the blends, because we try not to do multiple blends in a single day. We like to come back to whiskey and really play around with the blends, and then we'll do kind of a blind at the end. And sometimes we'll let different people kind of take leads on kind of how on a particular blend of the 5. And then we'll go back and we'll blind all 5 blends and kind of see what we like, what we don't like. And then when we find the kind of the top 2 that we like, we talk about the things that we like best, and then what also could make that blend better. What would be the thing that makes it that next step up? Because a lot of people ask us, like early, especially as a young distiller, they're like, how do I know that every time I buy a bottle, it's going to taste the same? And my reaction to them is like, Well, for us, it's not going to be exactly the same. For us, we blend like Harbinger to a profile, but every single release of Harbinger should be better than the last release. We're going to be using generally older whiskeys. We should be getting better at blending, but I don't think you've ever reached the pinnacle of what the best a blend could be. And I think every time we get in that room, the goal is to make it slightly better than the last one. So even after we come up and like, all right, this is what the blend is, we will go back and taste it again in a blind panel, the last 3 releases of that product. And if that one isn't universally voted as the best one, we'll go back to the drawing board and start all over again.
Right. So in Champagne, one of Dom Perignon's contributions was the blending of vineyards to come up with style. And most champagnes are not vintage. Most of them are trying to reflect they're a blend of vintages or they're multi-vintage. And the goal is to have a consistent style for the wine year to year to year to year. And the more artisan approach is, yeah, we have a profile that we want, but it's going to be reflective of the vintage. And so it's going to be slightly different. And you want to improve and so forth. But I think as from the consumer's perspective, we actually like the differences because it gives us something to talk about and argue about. If your whiskey was the same every year, then once we reviewed it, why would I want to necessarily go buy another one particularly if I still have some left over from my last bottle, because it's not going to be any different. It's going to be the same. But if there are improvements, if there are vintage reflections, if it does change a little bit, then no. I think last year, no, I think this year is better. No. Back in the old days, you should have the really good ones. They made them better. No, I think they're a lot better now than they were back then. It actually gives us as a consumer something to argue about because religion and politics, we can't get into that. So we need something else to argue about. And so actually having some craftsman, artisan differences from bottle to bottle, vintage to vintage is actually something we enjoy.
Yeah, and I think too, for a blender, that's what makes it fun. It's always striving to get to that next level, to that next thing, and it's not always coming out with that special release that year or something like that. It's even within those core brands, that how do we make this better? How do we keep moving forward with our mainline stuff? Now, don't get me wrong, the special release stuff is also really fun when you get to the blending room, but there's a lot of pride that we take in of making sure that release is better than the last one that we did, at least in our opinion on the panel side. And a lot of times even we will get outside people. We'll actually be like, hey, come in, sample these 3 things, tell us what you think about each of the 3 of them. And because I think sometimes also as a distillery, if you taste too much of your own stuff, too much, that you can become blind to faults,
right?
Blind weaknesses in your own whiskey. And so that's why I always encourage distillers, especially when people are coming in and they're trying to, they're going to start a distillery or looking at, like, make sure that you're always tasting other stuff, people in the same category, stuff in other categories. Because I think some of the most fun stuff is things that are inspired by categories outside the norm. Again, we're looking at balcones with, they basically had their main single malt is one that's inspired a little bit from the American style of whiskey. That's a little bit, newer oak, bolder, richer, than the more nuanced approach, which again, balcones hits all across the board now. But I think it's really fascinating to see, and it's really fun to get spirit that's been influenced by other things.
So the 3 things I tend to talk a lot about, and people know this who've been watching me for a while, is in my adventures and journey in whiskey and wine, is the people, the place, and the production. And I've been everywhere in California, I've been all over Oregon, I've been to France, to be at the place, taste the wine, meet the people, see what the place is like. And so one of the major reasons why I came down to Texas was to do that very thing, to meet the people, to experience the place. But one of the things also is, and why I'm going back to Scotland, is there's always stuff you can get there that you can't get anywhere else. There's sort of like the core range of whiskeys that get more distribution, but then there's always those special bottles that you can only get at the distillery. For Isla, it'd be like fish eel editions or something like that. Ardbeg Day has a special bottling for Ardbeg Day. So one of the things I'm looking forward to going back to Texas is to do some shopping, because even outside the distilleries at local whiskey shops or even some of the big chain stores, there's stuff you can get there that you can't get at home. And Matt from Whiskey Crusaders gave me some samples, to try give me 20 different samples, and I was really, really loving those, such as Andalusia. So you have whiskeys that are distributed that you can get at the like Total Wine and More, but then you also have some that are maybe only local or only at your distillery. Tell me a little bit about what you've got available, so people can come and visit you, see the distillery, meet you guys, and then try some other whiskeys as well.
So as far as the U.S. goes, in about right now we have 18 states, plus there's a few more states stuff you need to ship to. The Harbinger 115 proof and the 90 proof Harbinger are what's kind of available wide. In Texas, we've got Promethean. That's going to be the other kind of statewide release on as far as on the whiskey side of things for us. We also have a couple special releases. We have the Hubris, which is our purple corn whiskey aged in European oak. We have Icarus that we just released, which that one's primarily a distillery only, but there's a few independents that will, again, it's like 20 cases left at the distillery from that whole release. Which is that same Hubris that we took and for an additional 10 months, aged part of it in port cask, part of it in barrels from Islay, and then blended it back together. So it's like a peaty, fruity version of that corn whiskey. And that one was a kind of a lot of fun to blend because it was one of those that we tried to make a journey of on the blend, where we're like, we want to start out with the wine, we want that corn kind of richness in the middle, and we want the finish when you breathe out to get that peat on the finish. And I think, again, playing around with blends like that's a ton of fun. Coming up, the thing that we're doing right now that's probably the most exciting here at the distillery is we turn 5 years old officially at the end of this year. We started distilling August 14 and then opened to the public in November. So when you're back in October down at the Bastards Ball, we'll actually have the first kind of public showing of our 5th anniversary edition of Harbinger, which is basically going to be our version of George T. Stagg. It's big, deep, crazy bourbon. That's going to be a 4 or 5 year old. The other thing what we love doing though is some single barrel stuff. So we've got a few retailers across the state that we do what we call evolution casks with. So they come, they pick out a barrel, we pull part of it that day, send like 6, 7 cases out of that barrel. The rest of the whiskey continues aging. About 6 months later, we'll send them a little bit more out of that barrel. 6 months later, they get a little bit more out of it. So you get about 4 releases of it. You get to really see how whiskey changes and matures in cask, which is a lot of fun. And generally, it's from about 2.5 years old up to about 4.5 years old, which the last stuff's really, really cool, a lot of fun. Then we've just recently, there's been a rise of independent bottlers in the U.S. And a little bit abroad as well. And so for us, that's been a lot of fun because there's a lot of places where we don't sell our whiskey. And a lot of these independent bottlers, that's where they come from, those areas. So they come, they pick some single casks from us that we get released up in like New York and released in Europe and some other places, Asia as well. That there'll be some very special single barrel offerings from the different corns and stuff that'll be available kind of worldwide that we won't have necessarily here. Although at the end of the year, we will start doing some single barrel releases for the distillery. Like one specifically for trail members that will be coming at the end of the year, and then a couple at once. So when people come visit us, there always is something special that you can't get anywhere else.
I'm now a member of the Texas Whiskey Trail. I'm just waiting on my T-shirt. It hasn't arrived yet. So Texas has some funny laws. So are you not open? Like you can't sell on Sundays or something like that?
Yeah, currently we can't sell on Sundays. Although probably within a year or so, I imagine that's going to change. Walmart has sued the state to get rights to sell liquor in grocery stores, which I would imagine, which probably in the next 8 months that will go through the Supreme Court, and they will win that because Walmart always wins. And as soon as they have that right, then they will also make the state let them sell on Sunday because they don't like shutting down aisles when they don't have to. So.
Well, I haven't been doing it in a while, but I'm thinking about, if I had a whiskey religion, a whiskey church, And then we could argue that we should have whiskey available for sacramental purposes only.
It's true. Got to bless things. Lots of things need blessing, especially around here.
All righty. So, hey, I want to tell everyone in the chat, if you guys can get down to Texas, maybe not in the middle of summer. It's a little hot and humid down there, but it's beautiful in the springtime. I was there in April, and there's these bluebells? What are they?
Blue bonnets.
Blue bonnets. Really, really beautiful. And then there's these yellow ones.
You can either be Indian paint brushes or black-eyed seasons, one of the two.
Really, it was really beautiful. My allergies were way up. Yeah, I was sneezing like crazy, but it was really pretty. Really enjoyed the drive. The weather was a little insane, but that's Texas. There you go. So I want to highly recommend get down to Texas, check out the Texas Whiskey Trail, become maybe even a member, visit the distilleries. You definitely want to check out Ironroot Distillery. Absolutely fantastic time there. Fantastic people, fantastic whiskeys. And then even if before you get out, see what you can find locally at your local shop and pick up a bottle of what you have available from Ironroot. Highly recommend them. All right. So what I've got coming up on my channel, I'm just finishing up Texas Whiskey Month. Going to be doing 17 lessons on Scotch whiskey history. A video should be coming out every other day. I then head off to Scotland. So be over there for a couple of weeks doing my field trip. When I come back, I'll have another 17-part series on Scotch whiskey business. And that sounds a little nerdy. Perhaps it sounds a little bit, people may not be interested in it. But not only producers, but consumers at least have a basic understanding of the history of Scotch whiskey, because if you then study whiskey history in the United States, you get sort of a sense of deja vu. Similar situations, similar circumstances, the legal issues, the arguments, the lawsuits, all that kind of stuff. And then if you look at Japan and Japanese whiskeys, they're kind of going through now what Scotland went through over the last century and what the United States also went through. So it's really interesting to see sort of the deja vu of history and how events unfurl and how it affects whiskeys and how it affects your availability of whiskey, styles of whiskeys, the legal aspects of whiskeys, why you can and cannot buy whiskey on certain days, or why things have to be labeled or can't be labeled or whatever else. It affects the impact of your enjoyment of whiskey. So having an understanding of it, I think, gives me at least a better appreciation of it as well. And it's really interwoven and tied into world history, because war, religion, politics, and all that has an impact on it as well. So anything you guys got coming up in the near future that visitors should be aware of?
We've got this summer we'll be doing a few kind of fun events at the distillery. So watch out, first Saturdays of the month. We'll be doing a couple of special releases, some sneak peeks, some upcoming things up at the distillery. So first Saturday of the month, come see us, grab a cocktail. It'll be a lot of fun.
All righty. Hey, I want to thank you for coming on. Really appreciate it. It was great meeting you. Looking forward to meeting you again in October. If I don't meet you sooner, I might be down there sooner. I really appreciate. I learned a lot from my interaction with you and your brother, and from visiting the distillery. It was been absolutely fantastic, and really enjoying these whiskeys.
Thank you so much, Eric. And again, it was a pleasure having you up. Sorry, we spent a little too much time last time you were here, but
well, scheduling and planning is a challenge as well. I've spent 6 months planning my next trip to Scotland, and thankfully, last time I went, I had about a dozen oops. But providentially, everything worked out fine. So I'm hoping everything goes as well in this trip as well. All right. Again, if you guys haven't already, please subscribe, give a thumbs up, share with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and the other social networking channels. Until next time, cheers.
Cheers.
Hey, if you liked my review, be sure to check out these other whiskey videos.